Why are Christian movies so lame?
Why are Christian movies so lame? Man, this is a rabbit hole to go down. I think one of the reasons is that they often have a very specific agenda behind them. And when we talk about Christian movies here, I'm really thinking of films that are explicitly about some sort of transformation directly out of becoming a Christian, some domestic drama where somebody comes to faith or whatever. The language about faith is very explicit. There's Christian symbolism, iconography in the movie. People are talking about Bible verses and so on. Or films potentially about Jesus, retelling of Jesus. Those kinds of movies, that Christian world, I think are quite lame a lot of the time because they have a sort of very specific agenda to impact people in a certain way, to make people think in a certain way. And I think often that falls flat because with art doesn't make very good tools. You use tools to make art. For example, a hammer does one thing really well. It bangs stuff in, bangs nails into bits of wood and so on. That's what a tool does. But films and pieces of art, they're more organic, like a bunch of grapes. They taste different every time. They change over time. And it's much more uncontrollable. And so I think if you go in to make a film and spend those years and all that money, you need to be open to what that does. See it more like a parable that Jesus tells, where the meaning isn't quite clear from it, but it makes you think. It kind of moves you in some way, and you go away and you can't help but think. That's one of the reasons I think Christian movies are a bit lame, is because they get very stuck on it must achieve a certain outcome. And make people think a certain thing about faith or about what God's impact is on people's lives, rather than letting the story speak for itself.
Very literal.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're talking about Christian movies, we're not talking about the Passion of the Christ or I know the Gospel according to Saint Matthew or great religious works.
Yeah.
We're talking about kind of God is not dead or Beyond the Perfect Wave or. Are we talking about Sound of Freedom? I've seen it, you haven't seen it. Actually, for me, that was a lot better than most Christian movies. It seemed to be elevated onto a.
But would that be classed as a Christian
level
movie? I mean, I haven't seen it, so I don't know. How explicit is that in it?
It's pretty explicit.
Right.
Yeah, I'd say it is.
Okay.
But I think it's more intelligent. The acting's, very good.
Yeah.
Jim Caviezel's very good in it. The production design, the production value is a lot higher than most Christian bookshop type films. I think a lot of the problem for me comes down to the script and sometimes the acting, but it's the dialogue. It's like how many times can we get Jesus saves into every scene or just repent and believe the good news. It's like you're pushing the gospel into the dialogue, and most people don't talk like that.
No.
So it doesn't ring true, it doesn't feel authentic.
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately why Christian movies, a lot of them, not all of them, I've only seen a certain amount of those kind of films that would be categorised as that, fall flat compared to other films that it's actually about just telling the story honestly and portraying the characters in a real way, in a way that you can connect with and believe in as the audience. So I think that one of the main issues would be the script.
Yeah, and I think often the script does fall flat because of what I was saying earlier, that there's almost like a desire to sidestep the craft of creating an emotional experience that people can have where truth is revealed organically, and people just want to kind of insert references to the Bible verses or sort of catchphrases, Jesus saves and so on, as though somehow just saying things that are in the Bible or saying short catchy phrases like that is going to impact people. But that's not good art. That's what you do on a street, handing out pamphlets and shouting at people, doing street preaching or sort of thing.
Show it, don't tell
Show
it.
it, don't
the
tell
old
it.
phrase
Exactly.
in Hollywood, show it, don't tell it. You need to take people on an actual journey so they feel so much they can't help but think. You can't make people think, but you can make them feel so much that they can't help but think.
Yeah.
And there's something in that, and I think these Christian movies are not doing that.
Yeah, and I think also, you've got to ask why is a whole industry sustained on making quite bad, quite lame movies? And I think it's because people are sort of tricked a little bit, that the Christian audience by and large are tricked into thinking it's a good film because they hear all these catchphrases and encouragements that are explicitly to do with their faith. They kind of regard that as good, it must be a good film because it's a Christian film and so on, and they forget that actually there's all these other ingredients that make a good film, and I don't know, I guess people just grow up on that diet of movies and don't expose themselves to films that are moving and powerful in a much more organic way. But I think also that a lot of people are, I don't want to say quite simple, not in an intellectual sense, but I guess kind of have a very simple desire, simple need to constantly be affirmed with kind of very tame kind of Christian truths, and they wouldn't necessarily need to go beyond that to experience much of the outside world, and that's why it can feel quite insular. It's sort of this subculture is kind of developed in a way that is unaffected by mainstream culture, and that's why it lacks any power really to speak to mainstream culture.
It's like fridge magnet wisdom.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm going through a terrible time in my life. I'm going through, I don't know, hellish depression, going through grief, and somebody hands you a picture of a cat with a Bible verse on it, and that's supposedly enough just to fix that problem. Well, actually, no, we need more. We need, a whole multitude of, support and help and processing and being able to talk things to and being loved. And these films just can fall short of that because they're too literal.
Yeah, and also, Psalm 23 talks about God being with David in the valley of the shadow of death, and saying that David can fear no evil because God is with him. And so if you're making a film of his life or that particular moment he's referring to, then you need to show what is that valley of shadow of death? What does it mean for God to be with David there? What does David experience emotionally and in terms of physical threats that God's presence is actually helpful to him? If you just stay on the surface and everything's fine and kind of God's there and protecting David from things, you're kind of missing the depth of what that psalm is doing and what the Bible is saying, what God is doing in his word. And unfortunately, for me, a lot of films don't go to the depths of the darkness that they could and that they should. Perhaps others feel that they do and that they do touch on those things, but for someone with my taste and my sensibilities and my my interest in the things of the world, I'm not sure it does speak into my experience very well.
I mean, it's this whole idea of labelling things, that these are films that are Christian and these are secular films, and God works in Christian movies, but he's not really in secular movies. I mean, for me, that's a load of nonsense. In fact, God's more in a lot of secular movies than Christian movies. For example, The Elephant Man is not an explicitly, a Christian film, a film, an agenda, but it tells the honest story from the memoirs of Frederick Treves and other sources of John Merrick, and he was a Christian, as we know, and he would have probably read Psalm 23. And had a little prayer book and various things, and it depicts his experience of life, which was very bleak and horrific, but also his the humanity around him, and had this very gentle, poetic soul, and it's profoundly uplifting. There's a strong sense of God in that film because it just tells his story. But it wasn't, I think, created to evangelise to anybody,
no.
But it has such a profound impact, it's full of light, but it's incredibly dark as well.
Yeah,
it's a very frightening film. In many ways, feels like a horror film when you watch it.
It shows his suffering. It shows the depths of what he experienced, as a boy growing up, and the physical deformities that impact on his life, and the bullying and the horror around him. But that only makes his transformation into the most beautiful human being, in terms of character, even more wonderful. It makes it even more impactful, and that's what we're talking about, that it's not afraid to sugarcoat it. It doesn't really quickly kind of jump onto this idea that John Merrick, is this perfectly non-suffering Christian, man because he's a Christian. So you see him go through a lot of stuff, but you see in the midst of that he hangs on to his faith, and that's powerful.
I mean, when Anthony Hopkins, Frederick Treves, who plays Frederick Treves in the film, looks at John Merrick for the first time, you know, and the camera obviously, you know, sort of like moves in and then just stops at his eye, and one tear comes out of his eye, and he sees the Elephant Man for the first time behind John Merrick behind the curtain. That's a moment of profound truth. That's beyond words. You know, and Christian films often don't have anywhere near that level of truth and honesty and power behind it. So we need to learn from why those films work so well. If we're going to make a film that has, you know, subject matter that is to do with somebody's conversion, for example, we have to take things from these other genres and other ways of operating into what you might call a Christian film. But I personally don't even like that label.
No.
Because it's almost like it kind of, you know, you immediately think, not very good.
Yeah.
Belongs in a Christian bookshop, doesn't belong out in the mass market and all the rest of it. But actually we need films that do talk about biblical truths and illuminate God, but told in you know, in authentic ways, real life stories, real things that happen, or you know, fictional stories, but inspired by truth and honesty, and not being afraid to go into the darkness and ask the difficult questions. I think that's what we're saying.
Yeah, and I think using the label Christian movie or Christian book or whatever is unhelpful. I think because there's different ways you can use that word Christian, you know, and I think people conflate the two. Because one way you can use it, which I think can be helpful, is like a Christian bookshop. You go to a Christian bookshop, you know that bookshop is selling books that are to do with Christianity. So it's a helpful label. It's like the subject matter of the stuff in this bookshop is to do with Christianity. That's perfectly helpful. It would be weird then if you went to another bookshop and it has sort of, you know, Christian books on the shelf, and they're not to do with Christianity. They're just sort of, they're regarded as being more Christian than others because they're more moral or kind of seen as sort of morally superior or something. And I think that people often think of the label like that, or they accidentally take the label to mean, you know, if a film is a Christian film, you know, it must be, because we have a high regard as Christians for God and for the things, you know, talked about in the Word, we assume somehow that it's like morally superior, that there's a hierarchy of art. If it's a Christian thing, oh, it must be good. And when you go in to watch a film with this sense of, well, it must be good because the filmmakers are Christians and it's a Christian story or whatever, that's really unhelpful, because actually you need to approach it with critical eyes and to be able to pick it apart and say, well, this part of the craft was good, but actually this part of the craft of that film was really rubbish, was really lame, and this is why.
And really, the word Christian in many ways, when you put it into genre, is like, well, it's a film that's going to be sanitized, isn't going to really have any sex in it, very little nudity, and not any swearing or violence. But then what are you left with? A kid's film for adults? You know, it's hard to understand what it means.
Yeah.
But I think we all know what it means. But by and large, those movies can be often very lame. And I think these are some of the reasons why.